Let's talk about some plants in this video. We're going to show off some things that really look great during the summertime. We're down in South Alabama, and you know, these are things that you can put into your garden that will look great in the middle summer. So this is one of those things where, again, I talk about frequently, folks go plant shopping in the early spring, and then you know, you don't necessarily have all that much color by the summer because those were spring flowering things that you purchased back then. But if you go and look later, you can see some things that look fantastic during the summer. These Hydrangea paniculatas, you know, where some of the other hydrangeas kind of get tired, this is when they really put on their show. And so we'll talk about Hydrangea paniculatas. There are the butterfly candy, butterfly bush series back here behind me. We probably won't talk too much about in the video, but they are back here in my background right now, and they're just absolutely beautiful. We have all 5 varieties at the house. You can go back and take a look at that video. There are roses back there, of course, that show off during the summer and other things. So that's what we're gonna do in this video, is show off some of those really beautiful summer things. So I start the video and you think I'm just gonna talk about flowers, but I'm not, because you can get a lot of color in your garden without having flowers. We're gonna show several flowering things, but not everything needs to have a flower in order to be colorful in the garden. These touch of gold hollies are in these big deco pots, and they were for a display, for a show display. And these things, I mean, this is probably almost the mature size that most people would keep these in the landscape. This is a gold Hugendorn holly, really tough little you know, small ornamental holly that has this mounding habit all on its own. You can prune them kind of tighter or let them have a slightly looser form like this one does. Great plant. And we have one of these in the garden at the house, and ours is still only about, you know, this by this, and it's in a little more shade than it would probably like to get this kind of color on it. Well, what a great plant for color, you know, without having any flowers on it. It does flower, very small little white flowers along the stems, and actually pollinators actually like them, but do come to them, but really not being grown for the flower, just that beautiful foliage. I'll skip down here. I've shown off mood ring Podocarpus many times at the house, another one that we've got in a hair too much shade, and so it's, you know, a little bit floppy, but this one's been actually sheared into a narrow form. And I talk about this plant being used as a narrow screening plant, and you can see here, if you're in a southern area, you know, where you can grow Podocarpus, you know, basically zone 7B and up. What a great plant for screening a narrow spot. If you've got a little patio area, if you're on a small lot in the south, this is probably the best plant to use, honestly, in a very, very narrow screening application. Mood ring, all the new growth has this kind of pinkish hues, interesting new growth on it, and then it can be sheared occasionally. It doesn't have to be done very often. You know, a couple times a year, this thing can be sheared like this to keep this really full, narrow habit. It grows upright and narrow regardless, but you can shear it and keep it as a really, really tight form. I show off the golden Oakland holly at the house occasionally, and we have one in a container and one in the back garden. Our one in the back garden is already in 3 years, about 7.5 feet tall or so. Just a great plant. It's another, again, not one that's going to be grown for flowers. It does flower, it does berry, but it really, would it need to? I mean, it's going to be a show off in the garden. And again, I'm trying to show off some of these plants in larger containers today so that you can see, you know, kind of the form they'll take. This one just naturally grows upright and narrow. We have not pruned either one of our golden Oakland holly. So if you see them in the kind of big tour videos that we've put up, they've never been pruned at all. This is how they grow. You don't really need to do any maintenance to that. This is a Roman candle Podocarpus. Again, it's going to have a similar growth habit to mood ring. This one's been in this container for a long time. It's kind of funny. It's been, I think they've probably taken some cuttings off of it a few times, you know, making some new ones, and that's kind of made it kind of small and a little more bunchy. But what a beautiful plant. It gets this white, anytime it's actively growing, it has this white foliage on it. Great plant. We've got one next to the porch that's about this tall by about that tall, and one out in the front garden as well. Really love this plant. If we have 2 of them, they're great plants. Same with that golden Oakland holly. Another one we actually have 2 of is this Diamond Spire Gardenia, and you can see it in a larger container. I've only ever shown this off as our little plants in the ground, but it takes this natural pyramidal shape, very different growth habit than any other gardenia I've ever seen. Here we are in June. These things will, you know, for us in Raleigh, they'll bloom heavily in May, mid-May, something like that. Then it'll put on a flush of growth and it'll bloom again. So every group of Diamond Spire in this nursery down here in Alabama are in their second bloom here in June, because they would have bloomed even earlier up here, like March or April down here in Alabama. And here they are flushing out and going into full bloom again. But what a great, it's just such a neat gardenia. I mean, it's nothing like it on the market, this upright pyramidal shape. A couple more great finds this morning. This is a Vitex called Summertime Blues. We actually have this one in our garden back in Raleigh. It's about 8 feet tall, maybe 8 feet wide at this point. Just a fantastic small ornamental tree. It can be kept, very shrub-like if you want to. You can cut it pretty hard in the winter time, like a crepe myrtle or something like that. But if you just let them grow, they'll become about 15, 18-foot trees, something like that, ultimately. They bloom in the summertime, just like crepe myrtles. They're probably a little bit longer bloomed than crepe myrtles. Crepe myrtles have a long bloom season, but individually, the trees, don't bloom quite as long as I think people think in their minds. Vitex really does bloom a long time, and you can deadhead these similar to butterfly bushes, and by fall, sometimes get an additional round of flowers on them. Great for pollinators. Great if you have deer issues, rabbit issues, very, very pungent foliage on these, and those kind of fragrant foliage, fragrant flower things are the things that are really good for, keeping those things at bay, those are plants that typically those animals won't eat. I love the foliage on these, on Vitex. I love the flowers on them. The bees absolutely love them. Great, great pollinator plants to add to your garden. The other thing about these is they grow kind of crepe myrtle-like, typically multi-stemmed like that. We've tree formed ours as a single, so you can buy these as a standard single trunk, but they typically are multi-trunked, and they kind of have a growth habit like a crepe myrtle. So those of you who are in zone 6 and zone 5 in colder areas, this is kind of the plant that you can use, that's most crepe myrtle-like, that's also cold tolerant. Down below that, the new Encore Azalea. This is Buddy Lee's newest Encore Azalea introduction. This is Moonstruck. It is a variegated Encore Azalea. So here we are in June. They're budded up and flowering again. These would have flowered. You're down here on the Gulf, they can pretty much get 3 rounds of flowering, and we'll see a couple more Encores inside the greenhouse when we move over to the greenhouse that are flowering right now. They'll get a spring flower, some residual summer flowers, and then a heavy fall flowering. Up in Raleigh, I tend to get the full spring flowering like you'd expect on azaleas, and then we get the full fall flowering. A couple flowers during the summer, but not as many. We just have a shorter season. That's kind of the reason that they get 3 down here and we get 2 up there. This variegated one is fantastic. So as I'm looking at this in the summertime, normally azaleas bloom and then they kind of fade back into the background as a green plant. And this one has this great variegation on it. And it's a very stable variegation. Every plant looks very, very similar. Sometimes with variegated plants, the variegation's kind of all over the place. But we have basically all of these are just clones of one another. And I think they're going to be great in people's gardens for flowering and then still being interesting in between each round of flowering. You can see how full these plants are. They were, Buddy observed these for a long time, to make sure he was putting out the best variegated form he could find. And these are really beautiful plants. One super interesting plant is this Skyscraper Senecio. This is going to be a perennial for folks in very, very warm climates. So, southwest United States typically is where people could grow these outdoors. But for us here in the east and in wetter areas, these are just great container plants. Really, really interesting container plants. They can be brought in the winter time. They just have this incredible, Skyscraper is the perfect name for it because it has this perfectly vertical growth habit. Really, really interesting blue hue to this one. These are actually in the Asteraceae, which is really kind of funny. Asters, we think of cone flowers and black-eyed Susans and those kinds of things. We don't think of something that looks like a succulent like this, but that's the way it evolved separately and had to have a defense against being not in rainy areas. And then of course this one was selected by humans and for its interesting habit and its interesting interesting color. Back behind it, this is a salvia that we've grown several times now. This is a saucy wine. This is saucy wine salvia. We've had the saucy red as well. This year, I think we have saucy wine. Is that right, Steph? Yeah, we have saucy wine. I don't see any saucy red, but these are great salvias. These tend to be annuals for us up in Zone 7, which is totally fine. You know, sometimes I talk about, you know, spending as little as possible on little 4-packs and 6-packs on annuals for things that get this big, but I don't mind spending a little more on something that's going to get, you know, in a single season. You know, this is in a little deco pot here that they've been using for a display, and it stays this full blooming all summer long and gets some real size on it. So, you know, I don't mind if I can find a gallon on these and just treat them as annuals. The hummingbirds absolutely love this thing. The calyx, you know, after the flower's finished, the calyx stays this color. And so it appears that even the old flower stems like this, that actually only has 2 flowers on it, but it appears that it's still, the whole thing's still in flower. Midsummer, you could take this thing, give it a 1/3 haircut, and it would just flush right back out and be blooming again, just like it is now. This is one of my new favorite plants, and this one is in a giant container. This is Royal Hawaiian Waikiki Colocasia, which is a total mouthful. This is an elephant ear that just kind of weeps down, and it has this is kind of a breakthrough in coloration on Colocasia, where you have this kind of 3-colored leaf as it unfolds, and the leaves will get larger than this in time. They're probably being slightly restricted, honestly, because it's been so aggressive in this container. It's probably keeping the leaves a little bit smaller than they would be otherwise. These are hardy in zone 8 to 11. Some folks will dig these, you know, put their elephant ears in and, you know, dig them in, take them in, take them out, and store them. For us, in zone 7B, 8A, I think they'll be hardy in the ground. And we have one we've planted this year. And so I'm hoping, you know, we can get this kind of size out of it next year as it wakes up. We did a video down at AgriStarts. If you haven't watched that video on tissue culture propagation, these are being done at some of these are being done down at that lab, and they were in that video as little teeny tiny tissue culture plants. And, you know, here's one, you know, in a large container, really showing off. But it is so striking. If you see these, and I have seen these at retail a couple times already this year, you know, I would definitely want to grab one of these. It's a great plant. Back behind it is a hardy begonia. That's actually a zone 7 hardy begonia. This is a Sterling Moon, but there's actually 2 more coming. One called, this is Sterling Moon, it's Harvest Moon, Sterling Moon, and one other that I'm going to forget. They're for a little further up. They're not out on the market yet, but they're coming soon. These are so amazing. Look at the top of this leaf, and then look at the bottom of this leaf. It's like 2 different plants almost. It's like a Magnolia grandiflora. You know, it has that beautiful backing on the leaf. The other thing that's stunning about this plant is how much it actually flowers. It is pretty much in flower the entire summer. So the flowers are beautiful, the foliage is beautiful. Again, this is a zone 7 hardy begonia. I think that most folks are probably going to want to spring plant these in zone 7, make sure they get established, you know, for a good season under them before they go to sleep that winter. And it's not going to be a plant that's going to want to stay wet in the winter time. So make sure it's not a plant, you know, spot. Sometimes some of our spaces in our gardens can be a little wetter in the winter time, so that would not be a spot for this, but I highly recommend this plant. Blooms all summer, and then even if it didn't, this foliage is just perfect. We really love Plectranthus. There are a lot of different types of Plectranthus. There's Plectranthus that are used in little variegated weeping forms in containers that aren't really used for flowers. It's a pretty big genus within the Lamiaceae, which is the mint family. Mint family things are good if you have rabbits and deer. You know, these are things that they typically won't eat. This particular Plectranthus is a show off not only for the foliage but for the flowers. The flowers are absolutely incredible. This is Magic Mona Purple Plectranthus. The dark foliage with the dark purple flowers. Absolute favorite of hummingbirds. We've had this for several years. This is one that we can keep in a container and bring in and out in the wintertime to keep it as a perennial, or, you know, just actually buy it, you know, intentionally as an annual. gets quite large in a single season, so you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck out of this plant, even if you're using it as an annual. And then, of course, in the deep south, they're very hardy perennials. Beautiful plant. It's incredibly striking. There's a Magic Mona lavender as well. That's a little lighter flower, but this purple is a real standout. One thing I'd point out real quick that's also kind of underused as an annual for us in northern areas is this Tecomaria. This is another one of those blooms all summer plants. This one is in a shade house in here, so it's not blooming as heavily as it would. This is a plant that blooms all summer long. That, out in the desert Southwest, these are perennials, and they're in the Sunset plant collection for those of you in the Southwest. Just great plants. They bloom all summer, don't require a lot of water to do that. Foliage looks great, but those over here in the east, we can use, Tecomaria as, as annuals, or bring them in and out. They actually become kind of woody plants in time. One other plant that just looked great during the summer months are Fatshedra, which is a combination of Fatsia and Hedra helix. I've shown these off a bunch of times over the years. They're typically going to be listed for zone 8 to 10 or 8 to 11, something like that. But up in 7B, we don't have any problem growing them up against the house. This is another plant that those of you in northern areas would put out on a part shade patio for the summer, and then bring it into a bright window inside and keep this thing through the winter. If you can get your hands on one. Typically, it has an ivy-shaped leaf, but it doesn't grab a hold of the things that it's growing on. It has to be staked up, to grow this tall like this one is, or it can be allowed to just kind of spill over something if you want to spill over something. The one we have at the house, we're allowing to kind of do both. We're allowing it to trail on the ground, and we've got it a little nail on the house where it's it's tied to the house. But again, it doesn't do any damage to anything. Just a great variegated plant, year-round color. Anytime I'm down here in Loxley filming, I have to show off some of these Encore Azalea standards. And here we are in June with these Encore Azaleas in full bloom. This one's been in this container for a long time. We have our standard at the house. I think this is Autumn Embers. Autumn Embers is a kind of an orangey red flower. I might be wrong, but I think that's what this is. There's 34 varieties of Encores with Autumn Moonstruck coming out with the variegated one I showed earlier in the video. But I love these standards like this. They are available at retail sometimes. I mean, I see some of them being grown here, so they're going out into the world somewhere. But just great plants. And again, down here, in the Gulf, they get 3 rounds of flowers out of them. So, they're back in full bloom right here in the middle of June. A couple more before I wrap this up. This is one of the Butterfly Candy series right here. This is raspberry, and man, this one is super, super showy. This is about as tall as it'll get in the landscape each year. And you cut these down in the winter time, in the late winter, if you want to. You kind of only don't even need to all that much on these dwarfs. You can just kind of clean them up a bit in the late winter. Great dwarf habit. When you see these at retail, the container is going to match the color of the flower. So if it happens to be in between rounds of flowering or whatever, you'll still know what color it's going to be by the container on them. But I think of the 5, I think that autumn raspberry is probably our favorite. Ours were not quite in full bloom when we left the house to come down here to the Gulf Coast. So I'm looking forward to getting back home and see them in full bloom. We had such a cool spring that it slowed the butterfly bushes down, which are typically in full bloom for us by middle June. This is a new Hydrangea paniculata called Sweet Starlight. And this one you can see is in the Southern Living Plant Collection. I really think this one's going to be super popular. You can see how the flowers are being held up big and tall. I think this is an important component to Hydrangea paniculatas. These will grow in the full sun for most people. As you get into the deep south, maybe a little afternoon shade is better on these, but this is the tough hydrangea. If you're entering into the world of hydrangeas, hydrangea macrophyllus can be picky about where you put them and where you place them, and the winters and all those kinds of things. Where the paniculatas, you put them in the ground, they grow, they bloom on new wood, and if they're getting enough sun and water, they're going to flower for you during the summertime. What's nice about this Sweet Starlight is a lot of times, up in the north, in the northern areas of the country, a lot of these different hydrangea species can develop color in the flower as the flower fades. But here in the deep south, the nights are too warm. And so typically we go from this kind of green hue to a bright white flower and then to just kind of a papery color. And we don't get any of those pinks or additional color changes in the flowers. This one has the pink showing up down here in the very deep south. And so I have a feeling up in Raleigh, this thing's just gonna be solid pink. So this is an interesting piece of plant breeding where they're reducing the amount of cool nights that you need to get the coloration to form. So even those of us in the deep south, we can kind of enjoy the flower color changes on these Hydrangea paniculatas and Hydrangea arborescens and the other ones that will do those color changes. So this one's called Sweet Starlight. I think this one will be available pretty quickly out in the world, and it is a striking plant. So thank you guys for watching. I wanted to show off some of these plants out here that were in larger containers and just, you know, show you how they kind of evolve and look. They have a lot of display pieces here that they move around the country and show off to folks some of the new plants out there in the world. So thank you guys for following along.